Today I'm going to be talking about disc brakes, and more specifically cable operated disc brakes, and we're going to be replacing the cable and setting the brake up. I've covered these in a separate video because although they operate in a very similar way to a V-brake, as in they pull two pads together, setting them up can be a little bit tricky at times, so I'm going to do my best to show you how to do that. So again, as always, the tools that you need to join in today are as follows, and the equipment that you need also is as follows. Great. Again, if you need to pause the video to have a look at the equipment that you need, please do so, and I will talk about the equipment as we go along. I won't be using all of it. I've put the equipment there because there might be a slight variation. Where I've got an Allen key, you might have a 10mm bolt or something like that. So that's just to try and cover all angles. So how does a disc brake work? Well, basically we have a disc, which is also confusingly known as a rotor. Let's call it a disc, which is mounted on a specific wheel on a hub that's designed to have a rotor or a disc fitted to it. You can't just think, I'm going to have a disc brake and stick one on. You need a wheel specific for that, and also you need a frame that's specific for the disc brake. So this frame here, you can see, has a mount for the caliper that does all the work to fit to. So basically we have a disc or a rotor, and we have a caliper, and I've brought one separately so you can actually see its operation. Now on a cable operated disc, what we have is a static pad and an active pad, and the static pad is exactly that, it stays still, and the active pad kind of does all the work. So if you can see on the camera there, the static pad is this one, and the live pad is the one that side, and as I move this bracket you'll see the pad come across there. You see that? And it's as simple as that. That's how the brake works. So the rotor or the disc would be in between that gap there, riding along, that will be going round, and then you pull the brake on. That pad that I've just shown you comes along, squeezes the rotor and slows the bike down. So there, the caliper's actually holding the rotor there because I'm squeezing the brake on. So that's how it works. So what we have to do to make sure that we get this brake working as efficiently as possible is make sure that that static pad is as close to the rotor or disc as possible without actually pushing on it and slowing us down. And we do that by this adjuster screw. I've got a different caliper here which has a similar system, a screw there that pushes the pad in and out, and again this caliper works exactly the same way. It just pushes one pad across like that. So to do that we just need to make sure that we get the bike, we get the brake on the bike, we get the caliper lined up, and what we do is we turn this Allen key which moves the pad in and out. It'll be difficult to see from the camera, but I purposely got a silver caliper to try and make it a bit easier. And as we turn that, it moves the pad in and out. This one actually has a little lock pin there so that when you finish adjusting it you can lock it off again, but a lot of them just have like a little notch system that just sort of go click, 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 click and a notch. So this one just winds in until it stops and winds back out again. I've actually slackened that off, so once I'd have finished adjusting that I would just nip that little pin back up there. But this one doesn't have that system. This one literally you just put that in and just turn it back and forth to where you want it to go. So it's important to get that pad set correctly before you go anywhere else, because if you have that pad too far over, when you pull the brake and this brake comes along and pushes it, what it's got to do is it's got to physically push that rotor across to meet the other pad before the brake works. So that gives you a lot of travel on the lever. So you pull and pull and pull, and eventually it pushes the rotor far enough over till it actually touches the other pad and the brake starts to work, by which time your lever's probably come back and hit the handlebars and then it doesn't work anymore. So it's best to get that pad set correctly, and it's worth having a look at your own bike that if you are experiencing that, that pad is actually set correctly, because these pads do wear, they are replaceable. So there's a set of pads there. They've been bought. These ones are quite expensive. These ones are £16. You can get them for about £8, something like that. But they are specific to the brake that you want. So on this one you can see here, this one fits a Shimano XCR, a DRXT, a Saint or an LX caliper, and that's the brand of the caliper and the model of the caliper. So this one we know by looking at it, this one is a Tektro, is it an IO or an IQ there? It's got the model number on it there. So that's what you'd be looking for. You can't just go and buy a set of pads like you can V-brake pads, because these are a pretty generic pad. You get different styles and different types, but 99% of them, they're just a generic V-brake pad and they'll fit the V-brake. It's not the same with discs. You've got to make sure you get the correct pads. So these pads here are no good for this caliper, they won't fit, so you have to make sure you get the right ones. Most bike shops will be able to tell you just by taking your bike in which ones you want. If you want to have a go yourself, you can take the pads out, have a look at them, go online. You can sometimes download a template that you can line your pad up with to see which one it fits, or just Google the name of your caliper and get the pads for it. So on this one, the pads come out, they're on like a magnet. So taking the caliper off, I can just pull the pad out like that. So there's one, and then the live one comes out exactly the same way. These tend to last quite well because the material they're made out of, they tend to last a little bit longer than sort of V-brake pads and things, but they very easily get contaminated. So if you like oiling your chain, especially on the back one, watch where you're putting the oil, because this is porous, so the oil soaks into the material and you can't get it out, so the brakes fade off and then they're really difficult to clean up. I mean, you can try a bit of brake cleaner, you can try putting a bit of warm or boiling water on them, a bit of fairy liquid. There's loads of things that people try to get the oil out. But to be honest, once they're contaminated, they've pretty much had it, you need to replace them. So again, if you are going to put pads in, make sure that you get the correct ones for your bike. On this occasion, we're just going to put a cable on. I'm going to check the pads anyway, but I know the pads are okay. If you did need to change them, that's how you do it. This caliper is very, very similar, but again, they've put a little lock pin on this one. So you've got to pop the clip off, take the pin out, and then the pads come out the same way as that one. These aren't magnetic, you see, these are held in by the little sort of spring clip at the top, which is then held in by that pin. So you have to take that pin out and pop it out. Again, if you're a little bit unsure, you can't work it out, Google it and it'll tell you how to take the pads out of them. But if you have a look, it's quite deceiving, because even though these pads don't look very big compared to these pads, there's still a decent bit of life left in those. They'll still go again. And as a comparison, you can see there's some new ones there, which I can just, and I'll just pop that open. There's some new pads there that don't have that, a lot more on really when you look at it. So yeah, so you could look and think, "Bah, my brake pads are really badly worn," but in actual fact, they're probably still okay. So just have a look and double check. Again, if it's easier, you pop the caliper off, you can have a look at that and check. Because I've actually done all this, I won't have to take the caliper off this one, I can just disconnect the cable. So we're going to do the cable. So what you'll need is what I've put in the video, in the pictures. But just while we're on the fact of cables, I just want to mention these. So for a mountain bike or a hybrid bike or something like that, or a BMX, this is the cable that you'll need. This is a normal 5mm brake cable, and that's what we'll be using today. A variation of that is this barrel type cable, which is more for road bike applications. It's a little bit smaller, fits in the levers a little bit better, and the way that it's restrained in the levers is slightly different as well, which is why it's important to use the correct cable if you're doing that. And not to be confused with the gear cable, which is very, very similar. This is the gear cable here, which we don't use for brake applications. You can see it's slightly thinner as well. One's 4mm, one's 5mm, and that's how you can tell the difference between the two. So today we'll be using the correct cable. We'll be using the mountain bike cable with the barrel type end on it. Now these cables come just a sort of generic length for us when we buy them. You can buy them from Wilkinson's, somewhere like that, probably for about £1, 75 pence, something like that. And you'll be able to just get, if you just want to buy a rear, it'll do a rear and a front. If you've only got a front, buy a front. Just make sure that it's long enough to travel right the way down the bottom, because don't forget, a normal bike, the brake's here on a V-brake bike, but on a disc bike it'll lower down. So if you can, just buy a rear. And the same goes for the outer. When you get the outer, you can get an outer in, we get them in like a big spool, but you can get sort of a set length. And again, if you buy a rear, you might get a couple of pieces out of that, rather than just buying a front to give you a little piece. And it's worth just keeping hold of. So we're going to disconnect this brake and we're just going to change the cable on it. So we need an Allen key on this one, because I can see it's a 5mm Allen key bolt on the end. And we're just slacken that off. And you'll see the arms just released down there. So when I see the arms released, what's happened is on this, the cable was holding it slightly like that. And when I've slackened the cable off, it's just dropped it down. And then we're going to use my cable cutters. These are cable cutters. That's what we're going to be using for cutting cables today, because they actually surround the cable as they cut, so they make a much neater cut, and it's less chance to fray. If you haven't got access to these, which not a lot of people have, we do try and keep these videos as simple as possible. You can use a pair of side cutters or a pair of pliers. It's just a bit harder to cut and it's more likely to fray, so it's important to cut the new cable when you're finished. Don't cut it to length first and then try and thread it through, because it won't work. So we're going to use these cable cutters just to cut that end off. Basically just to make it a bit easier to pull it through, because it's got a cable stop on the end of it. And also where it's being clamped, you can see it sort of squashes it flat, and that can be difficult to pull through here, and it can sometimes damage the inner that was okay before you start messing about with it. Then up here, we've got a lever that's got a groove that travels from the bottom all the way along, and it lines up with a groove that's in these adjusters as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to adjust this so that the groove all lines up. So the groove is at the bottom of there, all the way along. You can probably see it on that one. You see the groove's there all the way along, and that's to allow us to get the cable out. So because this is now loose, I can pull that cable out of there. Now the outer cable is fastened onto here with a clip, or sometimes a cable tie, which we can take that off. Again, we can just use some side cutters for that, just to pop those off. So, and that releases the cable from the bike. And then what we're going to do at this end, we're going to pull the lever, and we're going to feed that through the groove, and there's a little groove at the bottom of there, and that cable just pops out of there. Like that. So by aligning the adjuster and locking it up, it allows us to take the cable all the way out. Some of the levers are slightly different. Have a look at yours. Sometimes they've got a little groove at the bottom rather than like along the edge. Sometimes there's no groove at all and you've got to thread the cable through, so just have a look at that before you take your cable off. And that essentially releases the cable, which is in two parts. We've got the nice pretty outer, which is black, and we've got the inner that does the work. So when you pull the cable, you pull the lever, it pulls the cable in and out, which operates that part of the brake there. So we're going to change the inner, but while we've got the inner, we're going to change the outer. We're going to have a look at the outer. So that's no good now. Get rid of that. We're going to have a look at this to see if there's any damage on it. Sometimes it can get chipped and you get a little bit of rust appearing in there. You can see the inner sheath that's inside. And if that's the case, you want to be changing that. Or we take a new one. And again, what we do is we just make a new one from the roll that we've got. Copy off your old one, same length, chop the ends off. Again, if you've got cable cutters, use your cable cutters. It makes a much nicer cut. If you can't, then use some side cutters. Or even I've heard people using a hacksaw, just use a hacksaw to cut it through. Just bear in mind, if you do use something like that, there's another sheath inside there that will get squashed, so you'll need to try and open that out with like a small screwdriver or something like that to be able to use it again. You'll notice this cable has little metal ends on it, which makes it nice and neat. You can buy the ends, they're called brake ferrules. These are 5mm because the cable's 5mm, 4mm for the gear ones. And you can put some new ones of those on, make it nice and neat. Again, that's a bit of an overkill to buy a full pot just for a couple if you're only using one bike. But sometimes you can get these old ones off, like there, that one's come off there, so you could reuse that one, put that one back on. They're just nipped on sometimes, so if you give them a little wiggle, they'll come off. I'm quite happy with this cable. I think this cable's perfectly fine. There's no damage to it, it's not rusty in any way. I'm happy with that. But what I am going to do, while I've got it off, I'm going to put a little bit of lubricant spray down it, which is GT85. Just because I'm reusing this cable, I'm just going to spray a little bit of this down. Again, depending on where you get it from, it's £3 to £5. There's another one called TF2. There's Wilkinsons do their own version of it. Boys will have a version of it. It's basically a Teflon lubricant that just puts a nice lubricant inside for the cable to go up and down. And it just makes sure it's not too dry. I used it on the previous video for the V-brake noodle as well. And I could have put some down the outer as well if I'd wanted to as well. No problem with that at all. So I'm going to take the new cable, which again is just a fixed length cable. This will do a rear as well. And I'm going to thread that through. It comes through. And because I haven't cut it yet, it'll just go straight through. And to stop that from falling off, I've actually made my cable there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little loop on the bottom of the cable, just so that when I'm working with it, it doesn't fall apart, so that'll just stay together now. Nice little tip there. So, before this goes together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this adjustment halfway out. So I'm going to just move this lever a little bit, just so that it's a bit easier to see. And what I'm going to do is this adjuster here I'm going to wind it halfway, the same as I did with the V-brake one, so I can see how much of the adjuster's in that lever. So I'm going to get it so that half of it's out and half it's in, and then I'm going to line it up with the groove. So that groove, like before, is aligned all the way along. And the reason I do that is because it gives me a little bit of adjustment. These brakes have a lot of adjustment. They've got an adjuster at this bottom end here, which adjusts the cable tension here, and they've got the adjuster on the inside that I mentioned already, that allows us to move the pads. They've also got these two mounting bolts here that hold the bike, the caliper onto the bike itself, which you can see on this one here. And you can see there's a little bit of a gap on this side because these holes are elongated, which means you can move the caliper side to side slightly, which allows us to adjust the caliper to sit exactly in the centre, and then we can put the pad touching the, more or less touching the inner disc. So that static pad can be adjusted, touch the disc, back it off slightly, and it allows us to line it all up perfectly. But again, you've got to try and make sure that it's set as perfect as you can to get the brake to work. But I'm still going to have that adjuster halfway out, because that will allow me, once I've got this caliper all set correctly, that will allow me to make sure that I can adjust the lever travel. So I can have it a little bit of modulation, I can have it where you just pull a little bit and the brakes are on full. So also as the pads wear down a little bit, it lets me adjust the tension back up on the cable to bring that nice positive lever feel back again. So while I'm here, I'm going to have a look at this brake pad. I'm not going to put the cable back on straight away. Now see, that's nice and free. Now if you've got a black carpet like I have here, what's a good idea to do is put like a piece of paper or like a creamy coloured mat or something on the floor, because it helps you look through and it helps you see where the brakes are in relation to each other. Now I appreciate it's going to be very difficult indeed for me to show you this on a camera, especially with this bike being black, which is why I've got as many things as I possibly can to show you how it works. So what I'm going to do, I know this caliper's fitted correctly, and what I've done is I've fitted the caliper so that when it's on its mounts, these oval mounts here, the rotor is dead in the centre of the two pads. It's dead in the centre, it's not catching either of the pads, so it's nice and free. So I make any sound, it's not touching the brakes. So I've got the rotor dead in the centre, or the disc dead in the centre of those two pads, and I've done that by moving the caliper on its mounts. So I can show you on this one, which is why I've done it, because I appreciate it'd be very difficult to see on a camera. You can see that if I hold the mounting bracket, the caliper can go, you see it sliding backwards and forwards on the bolts. So that allows me to move the caliper side to side, line it up with the rotor exactly in the centre, and nip the bolts off. And that's what's being done on this particular bike. So the rotor is dead in the centre of the caliper, it's not touching anything. Now what we're going to do is adjust that static pad that we talked about. And we do that with an Allen key. And it's a bit of a fiddle because you've got to go through the back. And if you've got a long Allen key, it's even easier. But I appreciate that a lot of people, when you say Allen key, that's what they think of. It will work. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wind that pad in until, now I'm looking down here because I can see down the top. So if I've got that the correct way around, I can see down the top of there. I can see the rotor in the centre. I can see that the pads aren't touching it. So what I'm going to do is look down the gap, and I'm going to move the pads until it's just to say touching that static pad, and you can hear it as well. So again, I've got a piece of paper on the floor so I can see straight through here. I can see that the pads are miles away because it's dead in the centre, and I'm going to move that pad in until I can see it touching that rotor or disc. Again, it's a steady, right. Now I'm going to put it on slightly too much. So I've got it so it's touching the rotor, but I've put it on a little bit too much. Hear that? That's because that inner pad is just to say pushing on that rotor or disc a little bit too much. I've done that on purpose. So what I'm going to do is back it off very slightly. And I'm just listening for it to be you hear that noise? That's because that rotor isn't quite true. This is a used bike, it's a used rotor, and the chances are yours will be the same. So I'm not going to worry too much about that at the moment. Ideally that should be quiet, and if it was a brand new rotor, it would be. It's only just to say catching, and again I can compensate for that a little bit later on. So that's as close as you get it. Again, you run the risk if you have it too far away, you'll have too much lever travel and the brakes just won't be very efficient. So I'm going to now take my cable. So we've adjusted the inner pad, we've adjusted the static pad, because that's the only way we can do it. Now the lever moves the live pad, so we're going to adjust the live pad when we put the cable on. That's how we're going to do it. So I'm going to pop that in there, using the groove at the bottom, locate the nipple in there, and then use the groove all the way along the lever to get that in. And then what I'm going to do is just knock off that adjuster so that it's not lined up anymore, and then that'll stop that cable from falling out. It'll just hold it for me, same as the little loop at the bottom did. And I can check that's working if I wanted to by, if I just put my fingers on the outer, if I just do that I'll feel the inner move. You can actually see the inner move. Can you see it? Yeah, there. So I know that's connected up there. Again, much like the V-brake, decide where you want that cable to run. You want it nice and free, you don't want it tangled up and catching things. So I think I'm going to put mine behind there. And I think I'm going to have it roughly like that. Now I will need to replace this cable tie because this one didn't have a clip on it, a reusable clip. That must have got missed at some point. So someone's put a little cable tie on there, which is fine, but we will need to replace that. Otherwise we're going to have a cable flopping around the place. So I'm going to thread the cable in much the same way as a V-brake one. Again, if you are attempting a job like this for the first time, it's worth taking a couple of photographs along the way, or sketch out what you've got to see where the cables go. It's quite obvious in this one, there's a little groove where the cable sits in, so I can see where that cable goes. If it wasn't so obvious, if I'd taken a photograph of it, or again, Google's your friend, Google it and have a look. So we've got that cable in there. Again, I'm going to just pull down on that inner, and I'm just going to pull that lever just so that I know. I see my arm moving, so I know that cable's still connected. There's nothing worse than getting all the way through this, connecting it all up, and realising the cable has fell out at the top end. Another reason why I nipped that adjuster off so the groove isn't lined up, so the cable can't fall out. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to check how much roughly adjustment we're going to need on this live pad to get the brake to be efficient, and I'm going to do that by putting the brake on and moving the wheel manually myself. Now obviously I need to be careful here because I'm spinning this round. That is razor sharp in places, and the spoke's there too, so just if you are doing this, make sure that you're doing it out with the wavy fingers. Again, if you're doing this on a bike upside down, it's a little bit harder. It's much easier on a stand, and I've done it on a stand because of the video, it's easier to see. So if you are doing it on the floor, again, if you've got something that can lift the bike up, just put the back brake on and lift it up, spin the wheel, try it that way. So I know that there, when the lever's getting there, it's putting the brake on. So if I just spin the wheel slowly, there you can see it's stopping. So I know that roughly there is where that needs to be to put the brake on. Now, there's no point in me leaving it in its rest position all the way down the bottom because it takes all that travel for the brake to start working. I know full well that lever will run out of travel before it gets anywhere near putting the brake on. So this is what I'm talking about, the adjustment. So where we did the adjustment with the little Allen key on the inside pad, we're going to do that by using cable tension. We're going to force the pad on a little bit more already by applying the brake before we put the cable on, and then we're going to give that as its resting point rather than this as its resting point. So I'm going to put the cable through when it wants to go through. Here we go. And what I'm going to do, as I said, it's a bit awkward because I have to do it with two hands. I'm going to put the brake on a little bit. So I've put that on, again awkward, but if I put it a little bit too far the brake will come on, so I'm going to just let it off slightly. And again, I've got adjustment on that top bit there, and I've got adjustment here. So I'm going to put that on, I'm just going to nip it. Again, like I did with the V-brake, I've just nipped it. I haven't really hooked it up because I might need to move it yet. Now that lever feels really nice, you can see there's only a decent bit of travel there. But the question is it making a racket? Because if it is, we'll need to move it. And it's not. So as I said before, sometimes that inner pad, when it's catching, when you start connecting everything up and putting the tension on the caliper, just enough cable tension to pull the caliper slightly. It's moved it away from that inner pad. So even though that inner pad was touching a little bit earlier, it's not now. That's why I say there's so many adjustments on these that you can do. It's worth just making sure that everything's just tweaked, and just try and set everything in the centre. I always go middle for everything. Just put everything in the middle, then you've got adjustment that side and you've got adjustment that side. If you put everything to one side, you're going to shorten how much adjustment you've got either way. Just set everything in the centre and just compensate for it that way. So that's actually pretty good. That lever's pretty good. So what I'm going to do there is the adjustment's still halfway out, and that would allow, if it was a customer's bike, it would allow them to put a bit more tension if they wanted to, or slacken it off if they wanted to. And again, there's still adjustment there should they want to adjust the cable as the pads wear down. So that's a pretty good lever there. That's pretty good. And again, I'm not touching the handlebars. The lever's just coming back and stopping there like that. So I'm going to leave that. I'm quite happy with that. If it was a little bit too tight, I would wind that adjuster off and I would back that adjuster in. And the same goes for this adjuster here. There's an adjuster here that I can go up and down with as well, which does the same as that one. So as I say, you've not only got those two adjusters, you've got the adjuster on the inner edge on these two. So they're very easy to adjust up once you get them set correctly. And also, I think with disc brakes, the travel on there can be sort of too much or too little. If there's not enough travel on there, you're really fighting to pull the lever on. They're not as sharp as V-brake pads, because V-brake pads are made out of rubber. So as soon as they touch the rim, they catch straight away. We've already seen that these are made out of like a quite hard composite material, so they need a little bit more force to get on. Once the heat generates, they work really well. And of course, when it's raining or if you're going off-road and you're going through mud and things, these brakes keep the braking surface out of the way as much as possible. Whereas you go through a puddle that's a few inches deep, your braking surface on a V-brake goes straight through the puddle, and your pads have to fight to clean it off. And it's not as obvious to do that on a rotor or on a disc brake, because it's out of the way. So that all it usually has to do is dry it off a little bit. It doesn't have to clean all the mud and crap off. But because of that, because of the material they're made out of, you need a little bit more force on the lever. And as I say, if you've only got a little bit of travel, your fingers are doing all the work to try and force that brake on. So I think it's good to have an adjustment either way on a disc brake, which is why I'm going to leave that halfway out. And if it was somebody else's bike, which this is, they can wind that in if they want a little bit more modulation on that lever. So, as with always, go down and check. Because I moved this lever, I'm going to make sure I put that lever back in the position that it was, because I moved it just so you could see it. My friend won't be happy if I leave his bike with the lever sticking up in the air. I'm just going to check that. I hadn't disturbed the caliper on its mounts. I showed you that on other ones, so I know I can just leave that caliper mount as it is. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the cable cutters, again, side cutters if you haven't got cable cutters. I'm going to leave about an inch or so of length on there, and I'm going to snip that off. As before, this is kind of useless now, it's got no end on it, so if you have got a use for these, drop us a line and let us know what it is. At the moment we just recycle them because we have no use for them. Tidy it up out of the way so no one falls over it. And cable ends, you can buy a pot of cable ends which will do gear and brake inner cables, and these just stop the cable from fraying at the end where it can get quite sharp. Remember I said don't cut it until you finish, and this is why. That cable was very easy to work with there because it has like a bit of solder on the end that keeps it all together. Obviously we've cut that off now. So sometimes when you get cables they'll give you a little aluminium end to put on there. If they don't, blob of glue or a little bit of electrician's tape will do the job just as well, and it'll stop it from frame for you. So that's it. That's your disc brake set. Again, if you were changing pads or you were changing the rotor, it's quite simple. The rotors are held on by 6 bolts, and usually either a Torx key or an Allen key bolt. Just make sure you get the right size. These are different sizes. So this I think is a 160. It says on there 160, and you can get smaller ones. You can get bigger ones that go up to 203 or something like that, 205, something like that, and probably even bigger now, to be honest. So if you are replacing your rotor, then make sure you get the right size to change it with. And bear in mind that when you put new pads in or a new rotor or vice versa, you do need to give them a chance to settle down. They don't settle down straight away like a V-brake pad would, because this material is much softer and wears out much quicker. And that's it, guys. I hope that helped. If you have any questions about that, other than the fact that that needs a cable tie on there, which I will put on before I give my friend his bike back. Then drop us a line. So I hope that was it was a whistle stop tour. I appreciate it was difficult to see on a camera when I'm filming it on my own, and I can do some more on brakes if there's other areas that you need to learn about. If it was a rear cable, it would be exactly the same. The brake setup is exactly the same. The only difference being, like the V-brake, you have some frame stops somewhere, so that if you are changing out the cables, you might need to make two up rather than just a one for the front like this. And the back brake setup again exactly the same way. The pads are the same type. If the calipers are matching, your rotor will have its size on there, exactly the same as this rotor has. And if you are changing the pads and you are going to set them up, you do it exactly the same as I mentioned there. Fit it on the caliper, or fit the caliper on the bike with the rotor, everything dead centre. Put your adjustment on the static pad first. Make sure you're happy with that. If you can't hear it, get it so you can hear it, but back it off slightly until it doesn't, because then you know you've gone as far as you need to and you can come back slightly. And as I say, if you've got a piece of paper on the floor, it makes life a bit easier. You can actually see what's happening. You'll be able to see the pad with the rotor in between the two, and you'll be able to see this brake pad moving across and touching it, and you can think, ah yeah, I can see now. If that one comes across a little bit more, then it just has to push it. It always has to push it really, really small amount for the brake to engage. That's it, guys.